Skills Using Peak by Maria Yagi. So a brief overview of this study is that I ended up using the Peak Relational Training System, specifically the Direct Training module, to teach skills to a client. The Peak was created by Mark Dixon, and it contains an assessment portion and then along with a curriculum. After completion of the assessment, you're able to see what areas still need work and implement the specific curriculum that corresponds with those areas. The skills are taught using DTT, or discrete trial training or teaching, and you're able to customize the teaching strategies according to the client's abilities. So if you have a more advanced learner, you might be able to teach multiple stimuli and increase the number of lessons or programs that you are teaching at once. Where if you have a individual that takes a little bit longer for skill acquisition, then you might only focus on one or two stimuli and reduce the number of programs being run across the board until mastery has been reached. This study was a replication of the study conducted by McKeel, Rousey, Belisle, Dixon, and Czekly. A multiple probe design was used without any prompting or specific consequences during the probe blocks. Following that was the direct teaching of two skills, and once mastery criteria was reached, a follow-up was conducted a week later to ensure maintenance of those skills and that the direct training maintained. This was a replication across skills. I did not do complex verbal operants. Rather, the skills that were taught included tacting emotions and interverbal functions. There were a few other changes from this replication, including a decreased mastery criteria due to time restrictions and client availability. But overall, it was a replication to see if the direct training could be an effective method in teaching these skills. Methods. Only one client was used for this study. The study began with 3 probe trial blocks for each skill. So for interverbal functions, there were 3 probe trial blocks consisting of 10 trials each. Directly following that were 3 probe trial blocks for tacting emotions with 10 trials each. This was all for baseline. Following baseline, there were 2 training phases with as many trial blocks that were necessary to reach mastery criteria. The first training phase included the interverbal functions, and after mastery criteria was reached, there was a test probe that followed for the tacting emotions. Following the test probe, the second training phase was implemented for the direct training of tacting emotions. After the client reached mastery criteria for both skills, a follow-up test phase was conducted for each skill to ensure that there was maintenance of the skills. The mastery criteria was a little bit different from the initial study, as previously stated, and it only required 2 consecutive sessions at a score of 90 or above. The first skill taught was interverbal functions. The goal of this is that when the client is provided with a function and an instruction, that they will say an item or a body part that performs that function. There were not any materials that were necessary, so there were not any physical stimuli. The SD was, what do you function with? And the response would be an item or a body part. The stimuli specifically used for this study were, what do you think with, what do you walk with, what do you throw with, what do you draw with, and what do you paint with? After interverbal functions was taught, there was the training phase for tacting emotions. The goal of this is that when the individual would be presented with a picture of an emotion, they would correctly identify or name the emotion. For the materials, there were 2D pictures of faces displaying various emotions or expressions. The SD was, what is this person feeling? The response would be the identification of the correct emotion. So the child would just say happy, sad, or whatever the emotion was. The stimuli used were various pictures, one image displaying happy, one mad, sad, scared, and excited. Baseline. First, for baseline, the testing was for interverbal functions. The 5 functions that were previously mentioned were presented with the SD, what do you function with? The scores were recorded as either a 0 or a 10 because prompting was not used and there were no consequences provided for correct or incorrect responding. There were a total of 10 trials for each trial block. This was repeated then 3 times for the most representative data. The same thing was done for emotions using the 5 previous emotions mentioned. The SD, again, was what is this person feeling? Again, either a 0 or a 10 was recorded. A total of 10 trials were conducted for each trial block, meaning that there were 30 total probe trials, but each one was recorded for a 10 trial block. For a brief overview, there were the 2 teaching phases or the training phases. The first one was the interverbal functions. The 5 functions were presented in a 10 trial block with each stimulus repeated twice in a randomized order. The score was recorded appropriately to the prompting hierarchy or independent correct. Following that was the teaching of the tacting emotions. 5 emotions, again, were presented in a 10 trial block with each stimulus repeated twice in a randomized order. The scores were recorded appropriately to the prompting hierarchy or independent correct. The mastery criteria for this, for the individual to move on from functions to tacting emotions, included a mastery criteria of 2 consecutive trial blocks with a score of 90% or above. In this study, both programs were expressive. For each program, the SD was presented. If an incorrect occurred, then the SD was represented with an immediate prompt. The prompts were used for most to least prompting, using echoic prompting strategies, ranging from full echoic to partial echoic to maybe just the first sound. This was recorded on a scale from 0 to 10, increasing by intervals of 2. So a 0 was just incorrect, whereas a 2 would have been full echoic prompting. A 4 would have been a little bit less than the full echoic. The 6 would have been a partial echoic, and so on. If a correct response occurred, then social praise was immediately delivered. Due to the client's VIPs, a backup tangible reinforcer was not delivered until the token economy was completed. However, he did receive tokens for correct responding, which was also paired with the social praise. For each trial block, there were 10 completed trials, and the skills were airlessly taught in the initial trial block for the first presentation trial of that stimulus. Therefore, for the first 5 trials of the randomized order, each skill was fully prompted, and then following that, they could have been able to get independent corrects, depending on the client's ability. The follow-up phase. Once mastery criteria was reached for each skill, a test phase was implemented for each skill 1 week later. The test phase was conducted exactly as it was for the probes and baseline, meaning that there was not any consequences that were implemented for correct or incorrect responding. It was pretty much a probe to see if the skills maintained. 10 trials were conducted for each skill in this follow-up phase using the same stimuli that were directly trained. This is just a couple of pictures from the direct training phases for emotions. I could not get any images for the direct training of functions as they were completely expressive without any physical stimuli that were used. So this one had a picture of angry, and this one was a picture of scared. So this is just a picture of what it could look like. Results. For interverbal functions and tacting emotions, the client reached mastery criteria after 3 direct training sessions. For interverbal functions, the trial block score was 68. For the first one, the following 2 sessions, the score had increased to 100. Following the mastery of the function stimuli, a probe was conducted for the tacting of emotions, and the score was at 10% as the client answered correctly on a stimulus that depicted happy. At the follow-up, the score remained at 100. For tacting emotions, the scores looked a little bit different. The first session, the client scored a 62. The following session, the score had increased to a 96, but the client needed additional prompting for excited. And by the third session, the score increased to 100. At the follow-up, the score remained at 100. Here is the graph of the data from the study, and here is the baseline scores where the diamond represents the interverbal functions and then the squares represent the tacting emotions. Here is the direct training phase of functions, and you can see the increase of the scores, and then after mastery was reached, a test or a probe was conducted again for the tacting of emotions. Again, the initial teaching phase, or the initial teaching block, was around 62%, and then it increased and went up. Sessions 14 and 15 were the follow-up phases, where the score remained at 100%, or at a score of 100. Discussion. The peak relational training system was effective in teaching new skills to a client with ASD. The skills were rapidly acquired using this system. The client was already a little bit of an advanced learner, but the peak relational training system definitely was a very effective approach in teaching these skills. There were some limitations to this. The same stimuli for emotions was presented each time, which did not offer any opportunities for generalization of the various facial expressions or depictions of emotions across people or just across expressions for the same emotions. So while I might look happy and smile and show my teeth, another person might have a closed mouth smile, and this was not really taught in this study, as the same picture of happy was used each time. Also, there was only one client in this study, so it didn't offer for a lot of validity according to that, just because there was only one client and I was not able to produce the same results across multiple clients. The client used did have a history of rapid skill acquisition, which was a little bit of a limitation because we weren't able to see what it might look like for an individual that has a slower skill acquisition history. So the graph pretty much shot up from 60% to 100%, whereas with some other clients you might see a score of 10% and then increasing to 26 and then 48, and we didn't really get to see that with this client. Also, another limitation that was similar to a limitation in the original study was that the prompt-based scoring system inflated the scores. So where in other typical scoring systems, a client might receive a score of 0 for a trial that was prompted or incorrect, and the peak relational training system, the scoring allows us to see the prompting hierarchy and the effectiveness of those prompts. However, it does increase those scores, so you don't really get to see what it would have looked like for the incorrect responses that would have been included, and it really just increased the scores more rapidly. Overall, though, the direct training module was a very effective approach in teaching these new skills to a client, and I was able to replicate the results from the previous study.